Good morning, Lord Brailsford.
Good morning, Miss van der Westerhuizen. Now, you have a witness for us.
I do, my lord. It's Mr. Stephen Graham who's joining us today from Stornoway via video link.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Now, good morning, Mr. Graham. Can you hear us in Stornoway?
Good morning. I cannot hear Lord Brailsford. I can hear Casey.
Just in case, I'll speak louder. Still not hear me?
Mr. Graham, can you hear Lord Brailsford?
I can hear him very distantly.
Distantly,
but
okay. Well, I suspect you won't be saying a huge amount. He may interject, and I can always I'm very presumptuous, my lord. I'm assuming.
You are, yes, No, you're probably correct.
I can always translate if there's if it continues.
As long as Mr. Graham can hear you, I think the best thing is to start. I can hear him, and I can hear you. And whilst you're doing that, the technicians can work behind the scenes to see if they can sort out my voice. All right?
Thank you, my lord.
Good. Thank you. Right. I should have said good morning, Mr. Graham. My apologies.
Good morning, my lord.
Good. On you go, Miss van der Westerhuizen.
Thank you, my lord. Mr. Graham, please could you confirm your full name?
Stephen Graham.
And you've given a witness statement to the inquiry?
That is correct.
My lord, that can be found using witness statement reference number WT0381. And I understand, Mr. Graham, that the statement you prepared had some input from your colleague Richard Tarvis, who's a business manager at e-Sgoil. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And Mr. Tarvis has provided a confirmatory statement, and the reference for that, my lord, is WT0820. Mr. Graham, I'll just set out what I understand your history to be, your teaching history. You've been a teacher for 17 years, of which 7 have been at e-Sgoil. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And you're currently and have been since August 2022 the head of school at e-Sgoil, is that right?
That's correct.
And prior to that, from late 2020 to August 2020, you were deputy head at e-Sgoil?
That's correct, yes.
And then prior to that, you were principal teacher at e-Sgoil for STEM subjects?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. And that was from 2018?
August 2019, I believe.
Mr. Graham, would you mind explaining broadly, give us an outline of what e-Sgoil's offering was pre-pandemic?
e-Sgoil is an online education provider which was established in 2016 in the Western Isles, initially conceived to be a local solution to a local problem, to provide a degree of resilience to the system, whereby we could support schools who were having recruitment challenges by beaming in a teacher remotely on timetable to provide live specialist input into a school that was having difficulty to recruit. Now, with conversations that took place between our own education department here in the Western Isles and Scottish Government, Scottish Government backed the project and gave it a national mandate, as did Bord na Gaelic. And since our inception in 2016, we have been supporting schools to avail themselves of our online supply bank in order to plug gaps and add a greater degree of resilience to the system. And it's maybe interesting to note that prior to the creation of e-Sgoil, I'm reliably informed that conversations were taking place between our own Director of Education, Bernard Chisholm, and Scottish Government around the additional support and resilience a service such as e-Sgoil would provide to the system in the event of a mass disruption event such as a global pandemic. Whether or not anybody actually foresaw that coming a few years later as a reality, I cannot comment, but it is interesting just to note that it was a proactive step, I would say, taken by Scottish Government to establish e-Sgoil and give it that national remit from its inception.
Thank you. So pre-pandemic, it is essentially an online supply service. You were providing supply teachers to schools who are unable to staff particular subjects. Is that correct?
That was correct, yes. It's an issue that affects schools both in urban and primarily in rural districts. And in addition to um, supporting schools with supply issues, we would also be providing enrichment opportunities, maybe aggregating classes across schools for particular events, doing a bit of school twinning, and uh, maybe adding a greater degree of equity to subject choices as well, where that was appropriate, and doing some Gaelic enrichment as well, working in partnership with the Scottish Government's Gaelic and Scots division as well.
And was that a paid-for service?
All of the supply that we were delivering would be paid for by either the school or the local authority. The enrichment tended to be fully funded as a result of maybe funding secured either through Gaelic specific grant or maybe some other Education Scotland funding that had become available. And
I think you specifically mentioned webinars. Did you supply webinars to support people learning online?
Not prior to the pandemic. No. That's something that was established as a result of the lockdown and continues.
Thank you. That pre-pandemic offering, was that offered principally in primary schools or secondary schools, or a mixture of both?
It was offered to both primary and secondary, but the nature of the staffing challenges that typically affect schools meant that the vast majority of the work that we engaged in before the pandemic was supporting secondary schools with specialist supply input.
Excuse me. At paragraph 17, should be up in front of you soon, you say that when COVID-19 hit, the Scottish Government funded e-learning offer was established. Could you just explain what you mean by established in that context, and also whether that concept of e-learning offer existed as a concept before that?
To my knowledge, there was no national e-learning offer as it currently stands prior to the COVID pandemic. The COVID Education Recovery Group was established in April 2020, and as part of that, a few months in, the national e-learning offer was developed in response to that. In response directly to the COVID Education Recovery Group. And it comprised of 3 key elements. It was there to support and complement the work that schools were already doing. And it launched in August 2020 with 3 elements, as I say. One which was live, which was delivered by ourselves, so live, interactive, learning opportunities for schools and learners. The supported element was a curated bank of resources that had been pulled together by Education Scotland, and the recorded element was the third arm, and that was overseen by West Online School, which was a subdivision of the West Partnership Regional Improvement Collaborative based around the Greater Glasgow area, and they were accumulating a bank of recorded resources, recorded videos that would guide children and young people through particular areas of the curriculum. So that the various different stakeholders of the national e-learning offer would be in close communication, working in partnership, seeking to complement one another's work and ensuring that there was no duplication taking place.
Thank you. So just in terms, you said paragraph 19, that you talk about March 2020 onwards, when COVID-19 had started to make itself known within the country. We were very aware that schools, through no fault of their own, were not ready or digitally able to deliver online education. The tools that existed within GLOW, the Scottish Schools intranet, were not at the time sufficient to allow live interactive online sessions. So what steps were taken, or what did that awareness lead e-Sgoil to do?
Prior to, in the early days of COVID, the e-Sgoil team was very small. It really consisted of a handful of key individuals, and we looked to leverage the potential of that team and tried to take it upon ourselves to put out an offer based around the capacity that we had within our own team. And what we felt was needed was some sort of online, live, interactive community whereby we could support young people who were coming to the end of courses. At that time, I think the exam diet had been cancelled, but in terms of preparing them for courses in the next academic year, we took it upon ourselves to put out an offer there. I was delivering National 5 Maths myself 3 times a week to an aggregated cohort of young people from across the country. We were working in partnership with other organisations such as Keep Scotland Beautiful, Scotland's Centre for Languages, SILT, to pull together what we could to provide opportunities for young people to engage with learning from their home, where they had the connectivity to do that. As you mentioned, Glow at that point, which is Scotland's schools intranet, it did not allow for live video calling, and within Microsoft Teams that function wasn't enabled at that point. So we were using another product that we'd bought in and that we were using to deliver our core e-Sgoil work and service. And that, although it worked well for the purposes pre-pandemic, it did struggle when it came to scaling it up onto a national scale, such as what was required when the lockdown hit and impacted on every young person throughout Scotland. So that was, I suppose, the pilot phase of what became known as the live element of the national e-learning offer.
And you mentioned, just following on from paragraph 19, work that you did with Education Scotland's curriculum innovation team, and with work you did alongside Scholar, the Scottish online study platform. Is that what you were referring to there, or is that something else?
That's correct. Yes, as part of the webinar program that we put out at that point in time, we were looking to maximise the use of what was already out there in the system. Scholar is an online interactive learning platform that at that point I think was accessible to young people from 30 out of the 32 local authorities. And so as part of the webinar that I was delivering, I would be signposting the young people to particular resources that were posted on Scholar that they could engage with and would allow for their teachers to see their progress as well. Education Scotland's curriculum innovation team were very much embedded in all e-Sgoil activities as soon as the lockdown came upon us. They were the interface, I would say, between ourselves and Scottish Government, and were collaborating on that offer, working with other partners and stakeholders as well to ensure that it was fit for purpose and that it met the needs of schools and young people. Education Scotland staff were made available to us and were deployed to actually lead on some of these webinars and also help to prepare some of the resources and provided support where that was possible. And it wouldn't have necessarily been apparent to schools and young people that some of the teachers delivering these webinars were in fact Education Scotland staff who had been redeployed for that purpose to support learners in schools.
Thank you. And you say at paragraph 23, when the digital team came on board, we were able to launch something of an online school. And then you go on to talk about some challenges. Could you elaborate on some of the challenges of delivering that online school that you experienced? You talk about Glow not allowing for teams, and you talk about issues with VScene. If you wouldn't mind elaborating on some of those challenges.
Yes. Well, around the time that COVID came upon us in March 2020, e-Sgoil had started a recruitment process to recruit a team of digital deputy heads. Now that was in partnership with the Northern Alliance, which was the regional improvement collaborative that stretched across the north of Scotland. And had that not been in place, e-Sgoil would not have been in a position to respond in the way that it did when schools returned and young people were perhaps isolating and shielding. So what that allowed for was 6 digital deputies to be in place in August 2020 to support with what was at that point essentially an online school. As you know, all young people had returned to school by the point of August 2020, but there were a number who were shielding and who were isolating for a period of up to 2 weeks. And we were tasked with supporting schools to meet the needs of the young people at that point. Now, prior to, I'm not absolutely sure when teams within Glow enabled video conferencing, but prior to that, we were using the BScene product that I described earlier that was struggling with the sheer demand that was placed upon it when it came to delivering at a national level. So when teams did enable video conferencing within Glow, that then allowed for us to really ramp up in terms of the scale of support that we were able to provide young people with, because we had something that was reliable and could cope with the numbers that were requiring support. So essentially what the online school offer looked like, it was a twin track approach where we had a team of staff who were supporting small cohorts of learners for a period of up to 2 weeks. And they had almost a rotational curriculum where they had a bank of resources that would see them through maybe over the course of a month, and they could then go back and reteach the same lessons with different cohorts of young people. But at the same time, we had young people who were perhaps immunocompromised and could not return to school and were needing to be supported for a longer period of time. And that then required for a different team of staff to support the long-term learners. And from that, really, we were able to establish something of a provision for interrupted learners, which is something I know we're going to come on to discuss later on.
To discuss that in a moment. Mr. Graham, you describe in paragraph, how long did it take? So were those challenges with Glow and VScene ironed out by, is that August 2020, or did they continue beyond that?
By August 2020, my understanding is that video calls had been enabled within teams. We were in close contact with Education Scotland's Glow team from March 2020 onwards, and I think they were very aware themselves of the need to enable that. And I think it was once all safeguarding concerns had been seen to, and everyone was confident and assured that everything that should be in place was in place, that switch was flicked, and it then allowed for not just ourselves to deliver live lessons through Glow. It allowed for any school or any school teacher who wished to do the same to do that via Teams as well.
Thank you. At paragraph 1, I just wanted to ask you, in paragraph 130, you talk about we know schools were not ready to be able to deliver online lessons. e-Sgoil tried to play its part in preparing as quickly as possible for the start of 2020, but it became evident there was a real patchwork job. I do not think everyone had fully considered the implications of closing schools and delivering online lessons, or what was its immediate and long-term consequences would be. Would you care to elaborate slightly on that?
I think no teacher, as part of their training prior to 2020, would have had any experience of delivering online or even preparing a lesson that would be suitable for an online environment. I think the pedagogy and the teaching style and the upskilling in terms of digital tools and competency is not something that was typical across the learning estate. I think schools did their best, and I mean, I myself in the period of lockdown was at home with a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 3-week-old child, And so a lot of teachers did not have the capacity to teach from home in the way that they would have done had they been in the school building. And I think anecdotally we hear that some schools perhaps were much better placed to move online. Young people maybe had devices and had been trained in how to use various different digital tools, whereas other schools were not as far advanced on that journey, and young people maybe didn't have the devices available to them. And the other point I would make is that I suppose some young people felt that they maybe got too much. Other young people and their parents maybe felt that they didn't get enough. So I think everyone's experience was different, and it depended on a whole host of different issues. Some teachers were involved in beyond duty during hub schools, others were not. Some were, as I say, had caring responsibilities at home. Some had digital connectivity, which was good, some did not. And I think it did become, I suppose, a bit of a postcode lottery. And that's not meant as a criticism of teachers or schools at all. It's just, I think, reflective of the reality of the situation that we found ourselves in when the lockdown was enforced.
Thank you. I think before we come on to speak about e-Sgoil, if I could just ask you to comment on just a few of the particular cohorts of learners that you were delivering learning to. You've got a fairly full list starting at page 105, but if we could focus just on initially the students who were learning had English as a second language and what you were doing to assist them.
Yes, we would always, I would seek to summarise everything that we do at e-Sgoil under the heading of removing barriers. And what initially, when e-Sgoil was established, we were looking at tackling geographic barriers and staffing barriers. Now, COVID was a great leveller that put the same barrier across every child and young person in Scotland. But so, I suppose, in maybe 2 to 3 years ago with the war in Ukraine, and that we said we could support them to maybe overcome. What happened was that families were being displaced to all parts of Scotland, and had they all been in the one location, it may have been much easier to do something with them and give them a common experience. And of the teachers that we have on our staff is of Ukrainian heritage and is semi-fluent in Ukrainian. And so what we did to that particular group was also their families. Because it was open to all, it took place evenings, and it allowed them to be part and plugged in a live interactive Ukrainian learning community, which was supporting them to acquire the English language and also looking at aspects of Scottish culture as well. Something that was really and was very highly evaluated, and I think it's well received, and it's that could be used in others as well to support other groups of young people who have perhaps been resettled into Scottish community.
Thank you. And if I could ask you just on the who were impacted and what e-Sgoil did in relation to them.
With the subjects, obviously there are challenges there when it comes to the aspects of these courses. We have always looked to support schools in all areas of the curriculum, but wherever possible, we would look to use additional technology, such as of any kind of hands-on activity that a young person is doing. In particular, say science courses, PE, these kind of subjects, there are practical elements that cannot be over supervised and administered online. And so wherever a school does require input from e-Sgoil for a practical subject, we would deploy our teacher to do the theory of the course, and where possible somebody on in the school with the relevant certification and qualifications would deliver the practical elements of the course. And where that's not possible, on occasions we've actually put our teacher physically into a school to do a block of practical work with the learners, so that they are able to demonstrate their ability in all aspects of that particular course.
Thank you. And then finally, the placement-based learning project that you undertook with developing the Young Workforce Department and the young people you were assisting with that.
So our developing the Young Workforce project is a programme that, again, continues as a legacy from the COVID pandemic. It is an opportunity for us to, again, remove barriers to young people who pre-COVID may only have had available to them those industry and business partners and employers who were there on their doorstep. So what we sought to do during the pandemic was to work with Education Scotland's developing the young workforce leads to essentially level the playing field and bring all partners together into essentially an online shop window where schools could request input at a particular time or join pre-scheduled sessions where they would gain inputs from industry partners that would bridge the gap between school and the world of work and help to support them on that journey, perhaps, towards the workplace of their choice. And it meant that any young person, whether they were on Barra or in Barrhead, could access the same suite of industry partners. Now, as part of that package, we have sought to explore opportunities for virtual work placements. And again, in conversation with, or in partnership with Education Scotland, we've been exploring options there. And although we've done some work on that with our own interrupted learners, I think there's certainly potential for that type of work placement to become more embedded in the Scottish curriculum. And again, it provides for young people, irrespective of their location, with opportunities to work in an environment that would lend itself to that type of online placement.
Thank you very much. Excuse me, Mr. Graham, before we move on to speak about e-Sgoil, I've just got one more question for you in relation to e-Sgoil and the online offering. In paragraph 135, which is again, I think, under lessons learned, you refer to a paper that went to 4 secondary schools with the idea being that rather than duplicating and having everyone plan for a higher maths lesson, you could standardise the programme for learning across all subjects and have one teacher deliver it to everyone. The other teachers could offer support and tutorials to complement that. It was not e-Sgoil's decision to make, and the schools decided to do their own thing. The schools felt they knew their young people and the best needs, and that should continue during lockdown. What was your aspiration, or what the intention behind what you were offering there?
I think what I was referring to there took place actually just prior to the initiation of the lockdown, and that was very much a Western Isles conversation that we were having here within our e-Sgoil head office. And the thinking was that the lockdown was coming, and that teachers would face all manner of challenges in terms of meeting the needs of young people. At that point, we did not know how long the lockdown was going to continue for, and we did know that some staff would be more able to support their young people online than others, for the reasons I mentioned earlier: caring responsibilities, connectivity, and just proficiency in using online tools. And at that point, I think the e-Sgoil core team was operating almost as like a war cabinet in terms of, scoping out what could and should be done. And as part of that work, we prepared a paper, a proposal put to secondary schools in the Western Isles, thinking it would relieve stress on the profession, where we standardise approach and have our 4 schools supported. I suppose a common whereby maybe say maths teacher would be delivering live on lessons at any given time, with young people from all 4 schools joining that lesson, and then supported off the back of that by their own teacher. Now, in the event of how things transcribed, the 4 schools felt that their own teachers were best to meet the needs of young people, and I think that because A, we didn't know how long the lockdown was going to continue, and B, point in the year, the had won its course almost. The work that was to be done, all schools were actually at a different point in the curriculum and had delivered the curriculum in a different order. English classes would have been focusing on different literature, for example, and they felt that the best way of meeting the needs of young people would be to just allow all 4 schools to coordinate their own approach. But the option was certainly put to them with a desire to see a common experience for the young person, irrespective of who they were, and again to alleviate stress in the profession, to duplication, and make best use of the teaching resource as it stood at that point.
Thank you. And I did say e-Sgoil, but I've just got communication. You've mentioned today about those English that you mentioned you mentioned in paragraph 86, and I think which we probably go into, but you mentioned that Gaelic language regression for young learners who are due to go into Gaelic medium education during the pandemic. Primary education was also hard hit, as young learners had no access to the Gaelic language if they were from a non-Gaelic speaking home for the lockdown period. If you could first please just explain what Gaelic medium education is.
Yes, Gaelic medium education is an entitlement that is available to many families across Scotland, and it would see a child enrolled in school, in primary school, where the first 4 years, I believe, of their education would be entirely delivered through the medium of Gaelic. Once that child goes into primary 5, the balance between Gaelic and English gradually shifts, so that by the end of primary 7, they are fluent in both languages, and they are, I believe, 50-50 receiving their education in Gaelic and in English. Here in the Western Isles, currently approximately just over 50% of our young people are enrolled in Gaelic medium classes in primary school, in primary 1. And we've seen a gradual increase on these numbers over the last number of years. Gaelic medium education has been in existence for, I believe, in excess of 35 years, and we see concentrations of Gaelic medium schools across the Highlands, but in some of our more urban areas as well, across Aberdeen, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Stirling, and in many areas of Scotland, in a great number of our local authorities, there will be some provision for Gaelic medium education. And the majority of young people in Gaelic education would probably come from a home where there is not a Gaelic-speaking parent.
Thank you. And then, so this regression you saw, was that as a consequence of was that the impact on learners who are English or other language learners, non-Gaelic speakers, having a Gaelic education, but due to parents at home not speaking Gaelic, they were impacted by the closure of schools?
The first few years of Gaelic education is described as total immersion, and that is where young people at that age, as sponges, soak up the language and the vocabulary and the conversation. Now, the COVID pandemic took all of that away for any young person who was in Gaelic education, and we were very conscious of that, as was Scottish Government and, as I say, the Gaelic and Scots division. So we worked together as part of our national offer to ensure that there was a Gaelic provision put in place for young people who were in danger of regressing because they weren't immersed in the language at home during lockdown. And as a parent myself, having seen the Gaelic teaching that took place, it was particularly impactful, and I know how well received it was, not just by the young people, but by their families as well. As I say, schools did do what they could, but they couldn't. The e-Sgoil offer was there to complement what schools were doing by way of live interactive lessons, and I think it helped to support and maintain that level of fluency that had been built up prior to the lockdown affecting schools, and it's something that has continued as a legacy through our national e-learning offer moving forward, where we are supporting young people in Gaelic medium education with either one-to-one or one-to-small group support, where there's an identified need that has been brought to our attention by their teacher. Our teacher can go in to support school and support that young person, and it's plugging a gap and fulfilling a need where the school might not have, for example, a Gaelic-speaking support for learning assistant in their staff who can take the time to work with a young person on a particular identified area that they need some support with.
Thank you very much, Mr. Graham. If we could then turn, please, to the Interrupted Learners Programme, or e-Sgoil, which you address in your statement. Could you please, and you start that at paragraph 28 to 38, but if you could please give a brief description of what e-Sgoil is.
e-Sgoil is our provision for interrupted learners, and it began prior to COVID as a pilot, I suppose. There are a large number of young people across Scotland who do not engage in the school, who have withdrawn themselves, and who have not responded positively to any alternative strategy to get them back in school, such as a reduced timetable, home support workers and so on. And if you were to aggregate the number of interrupted learners across the country, you'd have the largest school in Scotland if you were to bring them all together in one place. Now, a lot of these young people, the main reason why they are not engaging with the school offer is as a result of mental health issues or anxiety, or there's maybe a diagnosis of being on the autism spectrum as well. We were fortunate enough to gain some money from the Northern Alliance in, I think it was 2019, to do some exploratory work in this area, because we felt that if these young people won't go to school, why can we not use digital technology to bring school to them where they are? And we sold it to the young people as engaging with them on their terms. And what I mean by that is that we could look to remove all of the anxiety triggers that were preventing them from engaging with education. So the need to go to a school building, for example, could be taken away. The need to have your camera on could be taken away. The need to have your microphone on could be taken away. And they could engage with learning using digital tools and ultimately be presented for qualifications. And the desired outcome was that they would move on to a sustained positive destination and become economic contributors beyond school. So what started off as a very small project with maybe up to 16 learners with a very restricted curriculum of just maths and English at National 4 level has now ballooned into a much greater provision off the back of the work that we were doing during the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 rendered every young person in Scotland an interrupted learner and gave everyone a taste of what it was like to not be in school. And because of that, it exacerbated many of the issues that those who were not engaging in school prior to lockdown. It exacerbated a lot of their anxieties and led to a deterioration in their mental health. And so it was felt to be the next logical step to take the provision that we had for young people who were not able to go to school and to grow that into a provision for interrupted learners, whereby any young person in Scotland from primary 2 to S6 could be referred by their school to access and be part of a live interactive learning community, which would allow for them to essentially join school from their safe space, which typically would be from home and most often from their bedrooms.
Sorry, I interrupted you. I was just going to ask you if you could describe the referral process and transition to e-Sgoil.
So the
Please
referral.
continue what you were going to say.
No, that's fine. Thank you. The referral process would see a school completing an online form. We're not naive to think that an online provision is going to suit every interrupted learner in Scotland. So one of the questions on that form is the young person willing to engage? Because where there's a willingness to engage, then we can hopefully do something there. So the school would make a referral, and the referral form would state that the young person should have been out of school for a period of at least 3 months, that all alternative strategies to re-engage that child have been tried and shown to have not worked. We would look for there to be a coordinated support plan or a child plan in place, or multiple agency support as part of that referral process. And the school would outline who that child was, why and how they had become an interrupted learner. And once the child is accepted, our guidance teacher would then set up an onboarding meeting, and alongside the school and parents would look to transition that person onto our into e-Sgoil, into our online provision. It's important to state that the young person remains on their own school roll. The statutory responsibility for the young person's education remains with that local authority. And we are very much working in partnership with the local school and with the child's parents and carers to work together to meet the needs of that young person and see them back into a routine and back into the way of learning.
Thank you. And you also go on from paragraph 39 and 40 to discuss the numbers, the increase that you've seen. Would you mind just articulating the sort of scale of the increase?
Yes. So as part of the National e-Learning Offer, we promoted the provision through the network of directors of education across Scotland, so that they were all asked to disseminate the fact that this offer was in place and share it with lead officers in their authority, head teachers as well. And we've seen significant demand ever since that point. We've not shouted particularly loudly about it because we are aware that there is a significant need out there, and at the moment we're operating at capacity with an extensive waiting list for all levels at the moment. And to advertise the provision widely, I think, would lead to raised expectations, and we wouldn't be able to meet the need as things currently stand. So in terms of current or most recent numbers for 23-24, we supported 170 young people from primary 2 to S6. And what that provision looks like is from 10 o'clock to, well, from 10:15 until 3:30, Monday to Friday, a series of live interactive lessons, broadly replicating the curriculum offer as it would be in a school. In 2021-22, we received 202 referrals from schools. 22-23, we received 219 referrals. In 23-24, we received 286 referrals. And we've currently got a waiting list, as I say, which is well in excess of what we can process. So I think we've left it open just to evidence the demand that's out there from schools. And I'm conscious of the fact that it would be even greater if we were to put something back out to directors or to head teachers again to highlight that this provision is there. So at the moment, I would say we've got in the region of around 20 young people in our primary provision. We've got around 30 in our S1-2 cohort. We've got 30 in an S3 cohort, with another maybe 15 due to start soon in S3, and there's in the region of 80 in our S4-6 cohort. Now, one of the anxiety triggers we've sought to remove is the end of year exam, and for that reason, our S4-6 curriculum, the only courses with an end of course exam that we offer are applications of maths NAT 5 and higher, and English NAT 5 and higher. All of the other courses that are available are equivalent to National 4, National 5 or higher courses, but they're what are known as Group Awards or National Progression Awards, and they are accredited with ongoing assessment throughout the year, and there's no need for a high stakes exam at the end, which, as I say, can be a particular anxiety trigger for a number of the young people who we support.
Thank you. And then just in paragraph 40, you obviously had a programme, not e-Sgoil per se, but you had a programme for children who couldn't engage, and you've now got these increased interest in your programme post-COVID. You referred to, in paragraph 40, to some e-Sgoil referrals making a direct reference to COVID-19 as being a contributing factor. Would you care to elaborate on that?
Yes. Every interrupted learner is unique, and they have their own unique background story as to how and why they have become an interrupted learner and have disengaged from the school system. As I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of our young people have a diagnosis of a mental health struggle or are on the autistic spectrum. And we have seen in the narrative that is provided by schools as part of the referral process, we've seen a number of occasions where schools make direct reference to the COVID-19 pandemic as having been either what initiated their anxiety and their struggle in terms of mental health, which led to them disengaging, or exacerbated something that was already there and meant that school became even more of a challenge. And it wasn't just necessarily the young person that the pandemic affected either. If there was perhaps somebody at home who was immunosuppressed or who was particularly anxious and exercised about the danger of the pandemic, I think that then at times led to a young person choosing or deciding that they could not or not go to school. And so we have a number of occasions documented where schools have identified COVID-19 as being a contributing factor to why some of the young people on our books came to disengage from education.
Thank you. Just before we finish off, just want to give you an opportunity to highlight or flag any key lessons that e-Sgoil considers should be applied to ensure that the impacts of the children that you're seeing coming through, children and young people, are addressed and mitigated through education, and or that provision is in place in advance of any future pandemic.
I think leveraging the digital learning estate and making sure that it is resilient and in place, and that teachers and young people are upskilled and familiar with how to use it is one of the main lessons I think that I would take from our experience over the last 4 years. Prior to COVID, Teams calls, digital tools was an alien concept for many of us, and I think having a greater awareness of these tools and how to use these tools in everyday learning within the school building would add a greater degree of resilience and capability and capacity for any future move to online learning, should there be a mass disruption event that comes our way. I think the Scottish Schools Intranet GLOW, its importance cannot be understated. It is what allowed for us to roll out a national programme of offers that was equitable and accessible to any young person in Scotland. GLOW is a national entitlement to any young person, and their school can provide them with their username and password. And that would allow for us to aggregate a class or a cohort with anybody in it from across Scotland, and would again allow for us to deliver any number of programmes, some of which we've described today. It's what underpins our current study support offer. It's what underpins our interrupted learners offer, and it's what underpins much of our developing the young workforce offer as well. So I would say that these things were would be some of the main lessons. I think it's also shone a light on interrupted learners. I think they are the hardest to reach young people in Scotland, and because of that as well, they can at times be the easiest to ignore. And I think we would do well to consider some of the impact that we've had, not just on young people who are part of that e-Sgoil provision, but on their families as well, and consider how we can develop a provision that would be available to all schools, a provision that's sustainable and well resourced to meet the needs of young people, especially given that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is now enshrined in Scots law, that can provide an education that meets that young person where they are at and supports and equips and enables them to continue with an education from, as I said, from their safe space, and supports them towards a positive destination. There's a cost to that, as there is for anything, but the value, in my view, far exceeds the cost, and it's something that we would do well to consider, and it's something that we are having conversations with Scottish Government with at the moment to see how that model can be pivoted and moved to a more sustainable footing to ensure that we can ensure that there's greater capacity to meet the need that is out there, and work alongside schools and parents and carers to support vulnerable young people who have, for a number of various different reasons, opted out of the school system and find it inaccessible as things stand.
Thank you very much, Mr. Graham. My Lord, I have no further questions.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Graham, for what was undoubtedly very thought-provoking evidence, which we'll give great consideration to. Thank you for your time. We'll now take a break and come back for another witness at 11:15 or thereby. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, my lord.
Now, good morning again, Miss Van of Westerhausen. You have another witness for us.
I do, my lord. I've got Miss Woolnough from Connect.
Very good. Good morning, Miss Woolnough.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming. Right, you're going to be asked some questions. When you're ready, Miss Van Westerhausen.
Thank you, my lord. Miss Woolnough, could I ask you please to confirm your full names?
So my name is Christina Woolnough.
And you've given a witness statement to the inquiry, and my lord, for reference, it can be accessed by WT0111. And Ms. Woolnough, you had input from your colleague Sarah McFarlane, who's the Policy and Support Officer at Connect, is that correct?
That's correct.
And she has provided a confirmatory statement, and my lord, that can be accessed at reference WT0792. Ms. Woolnough, you've been a staff member at Connect since October 2020, is that correct?
That's correct.
And before that, you were hired by Connect as a self-employed communications consultant, and that was from 2017.
That's also correct.
At paragraph 9, you say that Connect is a membership organisation of Scottish Parents' Councils, Parent Teachers Associations, and other parent-run organisations, and that the central purpose is to advance parental and family engagement in the education and school lives of children. Could you provide a bit more detail about how your membership is made up and also the numbers, please?
So we have about 2,000 parent-run groups who are our members, most of them parent councils attached to schools, and some parent-teacher associations and some other kinds of groups. Parent councils are statutory bodies, and local authorities are required to support parent councils in their roles and their responsibilities, and we have 25 local authorities take out Connect membership for all of their parent councils out of the 32 in Scotland.
And just for clarity, at paragraph 13, you refer to your membership in 2023 to 2024 consisting of 1,503 primary schools, 254 secondary schools, 17 schools that are both primary and secondary, 62 special needs schools, and 57 nurseries. Are those over and above the parent, teacher and councils, or does that?
That reflects the Connect membership, yes. So they are the parent groups associated with those specific types of school, yeah.
Thank you. Could you please explain a bit about what your role as communications manager entails?
So I oversee and deliver our communications, policies, social media. I work with my colleague Sarah McFarlane on the survey work and basically anything that involves communicating with our members or the wider public, and some press and media work as well.
And was that the case during the pandemic as well?
That was the case, yes.
I'm going to ask you just to discuss a bit of the work that Connect did during the course of the pandemic. Or before I do that, what does Connect normally do in non-pandemic times?
It does pretty much what we did during pandemic times, yes.
Okay, so that's easy enough then. Well, if I could ask you to provide information then about what you did during the times. You talk about online information sessions, for example. What were those and what did they cover?
So these are still regular online meetings and training sessions for parent-run groups, our members. We do deliver some that are open to all parents and carers and parent groups in Scotland. They cover everything from organising your parent group, changing your constitution, technical type things, social and fundraising, but we also try and do health and wellbeing ones and ones with broader interest, for example, careers, education with partners.
And during the pandemic, so what did they cover specifically during the pandemic?
We had just begun to move online with these information sessions. During the pandemic, we did some open-ended ones, question and answer ones, so we could hear from parents and parent groups. We also did ones about having your AGM online, quite practical type things, because everyone was struggling, because June is a common time for AGMs, annual general meetings. And we also did about what's parent councils, what's our role now, having sought clarification from Scottish Government about whether the statutory purposes of parent councils would still be applicable. So.
And who attended and in what sorts of numbers?
So I'm afraid I don't know the numbers. They were high over that year, 18 months, because it was basically only support and information parent groups could access. It was we opened them to all parent groups because we realised that, the 2,000 odd Connect members, there would be other parent-run groups in Scotland who needed support and information as well. We also it's a way of touching base with parents and carers and those kind of overseeing parent groups. So it was a way of kind of keeping a communications loop going with them.
And just for clarification again, you mentioned delivering information sessions. Did you also say that you got information in from parents at those sessions as well?
Yes, particularly the Q&A sessions, but there's always an opportunity to catch up. The mechanisms are using Zoom. There's a chat function, so parents and parent groups can put anything in the chat function, and also we invite them to put their microphones on if it's not too large a group as well.
And what was your involvement in those sessions?
So I generally was managing the chat, so also people can ask specific questions and we can respond or link them to some of our resources. So that was primarily what I was supporting. But
so you were seeing all the information coming in?
Correct.
You also mention at paragraphs 20 to 30, you discuss the survey work undertaken by Connect during the pandemic. You mentioned earlier that the work you did during the pandemic is what you normally do anyway. Does Connect undertake surveys as a matter of course?
Yes, and they're open to all parents and carers. It's not just for our members, so yes, we do them as a matter of course.
And if you could perhaps take a little time to just take us through the surveys that you did during the pandemic, please. We'll come on to discuss some of the themes that were coming out of that, but if you could just give us an overview of the types of the surveys you undertook.
So we did 6. Most of them were really kind of keeping in touch with parents and carers, hearing how their experiences were, what was happening with them. It was an 18-month period, actually, and we did repeat some questions throughout, like things about homeschool communication and how was that going. So it was a way on a pretty large scale, because overall, across those 6 surveys over 18 months, we had over 11,500 responses from different parents and carers across all parts of Scotland. So it was a most extraordinary picture of what families were experiencing. So we wanted to see what help and support we could be advocating for, because part of our role is to speak up and help parent voices be heard at national and a local authority level. And that kind of championing and advocacy type role is really, really important. That's why we do the surveys as well.
And who else was doing these types of surveys at the time?
Not anyone that I'm aware of. Certainly our first survey ran from the 1st to the 30th of April. That was very quick. I think lockdown was around the 20th of March. So we realised that nobody was hearing from parents and carers, that they were obviously isolated at home. So we very quickly thought we need to reach out. We need to hear voices, and then try and see what they're needing, see how they should be supported, and then share that with local authorities and Scottish Government to try and complete the picture, if you like, of people's experiences. So that one, I think, was probably, I've not come across anything that was as quick and looking at parents and carers and families' experiences in that time.
You said paragraph 20 that you did 6 surveys, as you've told us, and you also say that you wanted to track how life was going for parents and families. Was there a particular reason you felt this work needed to be done?
So specifically, we were hearing a lot about, public safety, we were hearing about schools, we were hearing from the teaching unions, we were hearing from other parts of the education system, and it seemed to us that the voices of parents and carers who were now having sole responsibility for supporting their child's learning if they could, and looking after their children, as well as working or dealing with ill health or all the myriad of things that families have to deal with. We felt that there was a massive gap in hearing those voices and hearing about those experiences.
And you mentioned at paragraph 22, again, that you wanted to understand the range of views. And again, at paragraph 26, again, you reiterate it was a strong focus on helping parents and carers to get their voices heard. There seems to be a recurring theme throughout the rationale for it about getting parents' voices heard. Who would you ordinarily have expected? Has there ever been a need before to channel parents' voices?
Yes, I think Connect was formerly called something else, but it was formed in 1947, so there's been a long history of trying to ensure that parents are fully involved in, school lives and learning, and are communicated with effectively, and have channels of communication open to them back to schools and nurseries and early learning centres. So there's a long history of that. So it wasn't a surprise to us, I suppose, that nobody was thinking about how families were going to cope, actually. Mm-hmm. And obviously a lot of the people in positions of authority and making these decisions, many had families, so they were fully aware of the consequences, but actually it didn't seem to be in the public focus in any which way. There was an assumption that parents and carers would manage and could manage, mm-hmm. despite obviously exceptional circumstances and having to juggle all their responsibilities.
I wonder if you could just then outline the methodology, because you were obviously involved in the surveys with your colleague, but just if you could explain the methodology used, what did the surveys look like?
So we use an online survey tool called SurveyMonkey, and we build a survey, test it, and then cascade it out through all our networks, e-newsletters, social media, through our tagging partner organisations. We have a very large, at the moment I think our Twitter feed is about 10,000, so we've got big audiences of parents, and then they share it within their own networks as well. So yes, it was online, but that was all that was available to us at that time.
And what was it, a tick box, or what did the form actually look like? What did it?
So it's a mixture of selecting options with comments boxes. So yeah.
And how were the forms analysed, and who was involved in that?
So we didn't quite know when we started these surveys what the uptake would be. We usually do them ourselves. We do them, and the SurveyMonkey has tools within it that can analyse the kind of statistics, and then we analyse the comments ourselves. On this occasion, we had the help of Scottinform, who used their various tools to analyse the first survey. The second survey, which had nearly 8,000 responses, which was pretty overwhelming, Public Health Scotland helped analyse those responses using their professional tools as well. So we don't normally have thousands of responses. We're normally in the kind of hundreds, and about 400 is a good response. So 500 is a good response. So it was a huge scale. So we were very grateful for the help with that.
We'll come on just to have a look at the numbers again. But in terms of your role in the design of the survey, did you have a role in designing it at all?
Yes, I usually do write them, yes, with my colleague Sarah. So I draft it and she makes sense of them.
So do you draft the survey questions?
Usually, yes.
And in terms of the report writing, who does that?
Sarah collates the statistics usually and gives me the raw material, and then I tend to write the kind of findings and the kind of calls to action, the asks, the what we want to raise, I suppose, with Scottish Government or local authorities or all.
And just in terms of these specific surveys, what involvement, you mentioned that you'd got assistance in terms of analysing them. What involvement did you have in analysing them or looking at for example, the tick boxes, the comments box you mentioned?
Yes, we looked at them as well, but they had the professional tools to, use keywords to analyse, types of responses in the comments boxes. So, but we did look at them all as well, yeah.
And if we can just run through, or if you can take us through the different, because I think you mentioned there were 6, and I see that you refer in paragraph 24 to how are you doing? And do you want to elaborate?
That's right. Yes, we did. We did ask how are you doing quite a few times. I was looking at this last night to just get my names of them. So the first one was a how are you doing, and then that was April 1st to 30th. The second one was.
Perhaps we can just pause on the first one. What were you looking at, or what?
So we were literally asking people how were they doing. So we were looking at whether they had what they needed. So these were very open types of questions. Did they have what they needed? Was there effective communication with the school? Because I think early doors it was do what you can at home type of thing in terms of children's learning. So it was really a kind of a little test to see what was going on. So, and at that point, I think nearly 60% of parents had a concern about the information that they weren't getting and the equipment that they didn't have for doing schoolwork. So, I guess it was panicky, I suppose. And I think over that whole month of April, you could see that the responses showed people were getting less panicked and more having what they needed and improving communication between the school and home.
And that one, I think you say, had 1,578 responses from across 29 local authorities. You did another one called Our Next Steps in May-June 2020, and that was the big one. That was the 7,858 responses from all 32 local authorities. What were you asking in that one, or looking at in that one?
So we were trying to see whether things had improved for people over that period of time, and we were trying to drill down into where the areas of difficulty were. I was checking back yesterday. We did an interim report. Obviously, we were getting towards the end of the school term at the end date of that particular second survey, which was 30th of June. So we did an interim report and we did a series of briefings around the findings of Survey 1 compiled with the kind of interim findings of Survey 2. And that led us to do these briefing sessions with, I think, we invited about 100 different organisations and bodies to attend these briefing sessions, and we created a set of asks from that as well as writing to the Cabinet Secretary at the time, John Swinney.
And what were your asks?
The asks were, now you're testing my memory.
Just in general terms, we don't need to.
Okay, in general terms, it was about provision for children with additional support needs, improving communications, about the return back to school, and there was a lot of talk at that time about part-time schooling and rotas, and some children will be in 2 days and then not till the next week, and different children of different ages were going to be in different days. So I think that was a huge response in that survey because people were very exercised about the prospect of that. So that was the kind of May-June discussions.
And you mentioned, I think you said 100 or so bodies. Who were they?
So to both of them, we invited the 30 Directors of Education to the first session. That was on June the 3rd, as well as COSLA and all the unions. The second session, which was on the 4th of June, we invited local authority parental involvement officers. So there's kind of about 32 of them, and we also invited third sector partners, and we invited some the education spokespersons for the different political parties, and the Scottish Government and the Education Committee from the Scottish Parliament we invited to that second briefing session.
And who came or didn't come? Who were you expecting?
We had about 30 attending across the two sessions out of the 100 invitees. We haven't got a record, unfortunately. We don't have that Eventbrite page anymore. So I could see in the chat only who had put something into the chat, but I know it was over 30 across the two sessions. So.
Okay. Was the Scottish Government there, or was it local authorities?
There were some local authority representatives. I think we did a separate briefing session with Education Scotland, which I think was on the 2nd, or with some officers from Education Scotland on the 2nd of June. And we were also having regular meetings with the parental involvement team at Scottish Government. So I can't tell you who exactly came to these sessions, unfortunately.
You then referred to a third survey back at school. What was that one about?
So that one again was all children were back to school at that point. So we looked about how the communications between home and school were going so we could compare with the previous surveys. We looked at access to digital devices, we looked at school in attendance and the impacts of the various changes in schools. We specifically wanted to know whether schools had asked families about their experiences during the previous, 6 months, because they were having a focus on health and well-being, and we felt that they couldn't, and that was the Scottish Government directive, concentrate on health and well-being for children and young people, and we felt that they couldn't know how the children might be if they didn't know what had gone on in people's families. And the vast majority said they had not been asked. 79% of respondents said they had not been asked about their families' experiences during lockdown.
Was there a similar session to feedback the responses of, or the results of that survey?
I think we cascaded out through our networks. We wrote to the Cabinet Secretary, John Swinney, on the 26th of November. There was a lot of concerns about the ongoing absences of children and young people and their teachers because of COVID, or they were being required to stay at home for that set period of time. So the online learning didn't seem to be happening consistently for when children were sporadically off ill. So there was a lot of concern in parents about children's learning progress and preparation for SQA qualification. So that's what we wrote to John Swinney about. So that was the area of our campaigning around that.
And then you referred to a digital survey in paragraph 25. Was that the next one?
That's right. That was run November to December 2020, and it was asking about access to internet and devices.
And that was a specific digital, yeah.
Yes.
And how many responses was that?
That had 419 responses, and again we were looking at 20% had okay or poor internet service. So we were asking about the devices and whether they had access to the internet. So kind of throughout all of them, there's 20 to 30% of people who are struggling or don't have what they need. So there's this kind of consistent, it may not be the same people, but it's a consistent, a fifth to a third type of thing.
The next one you mentioned is COVID-19 lockdown, I think. May not be mentioned by name. What was the next one?
So the next one was called Lockdown 2021. It was asking, how are you doing again? And that was the name of it. So that was 7th February to 31st March 2021. And that was looking at, I guess this was our second experience of a lockdown. So we were looking again about communications and how experiences compared, i.e. had lessons been learned from the first lockdown? Was there provision for online learning? Were communications in place? How was that all going? So people generally felt it was more organised. So across the piece from this one to the first one, we're now ending up with 70% saying that it was more organised. They felt there was more activities and more structure, but 19% still said it was okay, was as poor as before, or was worse. We were also looking at the use of hubs and whether children were in these hubs or not. And we were asking how parents were feeling. So we had 55% saying they were okay some of the time and not okay some of the time, and 6% were not okay all of the time, and 69% of parents with children with additional supports gave these two responses. So,
and the last of the 6, what was that called?
It's called How's It Going? So that was again asking about the ongoing impact of absence because of COVID, about communication about COVID. There was a lot more, I guess, public health information about COVID coming directly from schools at that time. We were also asking about mental health support and remote learning again. And so over half said their child had had periods of absence, so there was quite a lot of concerns around that again, and again about SQA qualifications and presentation.
And the concerns about periods of absence, what were the specific concerns, and what were the reasons for the absenteeism?
So the absence were to do with COVID, as far as we know. COVID related was what we asked about. And we know that the concerns were about missed learning because it was quite clear when individual or 1 or 2 or 3 children were not in a class, they were not getting the learning, and the arrangements were not necessarily being made by schools for those individual children. And huge workload, obviously, but teachers seemed more able to provide learning for whole classes by the latter part of 2020 than they were for sporadic individual absences. That seemed to be problematic.
You've already mentioned the online events and the engagement with the Scottish ministers, and you've described some improvement over the course. How were your survey results and reports received, and what was done on the back of them, if anything?
I would say that, ironically, we promoted them and sent them out to all our mail lists and to stakeholders. We shared, because it was the election, wasn't it? We shared all links to all of the reports with the new MSPs, and also there was a new Cabinet Secretary for Education, so they were shared with her as well. So I would say engagement was probably less the more time went on. The parental involvement team at Scottish Government continued to meet with Connect, so we were feeding back mostly through that. What they did with that information, I don't know. We weren't on the SERG education kind of group looking at the COVID response, and we didn't hear back from that, but we did write to them as well to share our findings. We don't know is the answer.
And SERG being COVID Education Recovery Group?
Yes.
Was there any parental representation?
There was the National Parent Forum of Scotland. They're volunteers. I should say that the person sitting on that was a parent volunteer, so it was a massive responsibility.
Mm-hmm. I think we'll come on to discuss the impacts in a moment. I just wanted to... if we can have a discussion now about some of the impacts, because obviously you've lodged the reports, but you were involved in writing them, and you were also involved in analysing the underlying data, and you've put in your statement some of the impacts that were felt. But if we could perhaps just tease out some of them, and you can give us some insight into the thinking and what the specific concerns were, because obviously we can see what the overall concerns were, but percentages don't really mean as much as hearing what the underlying concerns were. So you discuss impacts on families from page 31 of your statement. What was the source of the information that you used for your witness statement? Was this the survey data, and was there any other information that you gleaned during the pandemic?
These information sessions, which were attended by parents and carers and parent groups, so information did come through them, through the chat, or by people speaking. We also have email, so people can email us as well about any particular concerns and so on.
Thank you. If we could maybe spend a little time just discussing remote, it's not a specific heading, you have the heading impacts relating to online teaching, digital literacy, access to information, etc. But if we can perhaps just discuss remote learning as a concept, once the schools closed and students were sent home or pupils were sent home and they were doing remote learning, just some of the issues you touch on in here, and if I can ask you just to elaborate on those. For example, during the pandemic, children and young people had to cope, obviously, with the disruption to their schooling, and they had to immediately engage in a different way of learning, i.e. remote learning, and obviously families had to try and support them, often when trying to do their own work at home. So I think the first one I'd like you to just elaborate a bit on is something we've heard quite a lot about across the board in relation to different contexts, not just in relation to education, but it's access to digital services and digital connectivity. You talk about it at paragraph 31, but if you could perhaps just articulate what you were hearing from parents about this particular aspect.
I think the upshot is that it was slow to start, and it didn't work for everybody. If people don't have, and they didn't have enough devices in their homes, or they didn't have good internet connectivity, they couldn't manage the kind of apps and platforms that were being used by schools. It excluded them from the learning. We did ask for and encourage the delivery of packs to families, and some parent groups were involved with other community groups in delivering these door to door, or they had them in supermarkets. So as time went on, people got more creative about how to support children and young people with learning materials. There's an assumption people have pencils and paper in their houses. They often don't. So there were issues around connectivity, devices. We had one refugee family responding to the survey who had one pay-as-you-go mobile phone between a family of several children, and they were in despair. And we had people in rural areas, and we had people who worked outside the home who could not support their children's learning, or people who weren't well and didn't feel confident. One of our surveys asked about support and information and training for parents about how to use digital devices, and most respondents have said they hadn't had any support or information. There was an assumption, I think, early on that people had the kit, they had the internet that was good enough, and that they had the time and the knowledge to do it, and lots of people don't. Of course they don't.
And I don't know whether your data showed, or were you able to discern any particular differential impacts on particular groups of parents or children?
I think obviously there were parents with younger children, or parents with children with additional support needs, who couldn't cope with sitting down doing schoolwork at home. So I think there were challenges, and also parents who were working out of the house. There were issues for some families around even trying, because it was too difficult. It was impossible in their circumstances, or they weren't well, and it was just another stress in an already stressful situation.
In terms of, I mentioned some parents would have been working, others wouldn't have been, but were there any on parents in terms of managing work and children, any specific aspects of that were articulated, or was it just generally a trial?
I think we heard all sorts of variations of how families that could manage to get to deliver some kind of schoolwork at home. Some families with two adults in the household, one would work from 5 a.m. till lunchtime, and then the other would take over. We had parents who shared parenting, living in different households, moving back in together. We had, grandmother moving in to help a single parent. So people were as creative and as imaginative as they possibly could be to try and, support their children. But still that's not possible for everybody. But yeah, it was a massive stress. Whether you could manage it or you couldn't, I think it was a massive stress.
And some of those who weren't able to manage it, did you hear from some?
Yes, they were, well, some of them indeed were shift workers, or they were working for the NHS, and there were some people who weren't well or didn't have the devices, or they had children, particularly with neurodiverse conditions, who lost the structure of their school day and could not and would not try and do any schoolwork. They were unable to engage with it. So.
And during that period, during the initial lockdown, when children were at home, what were, if any, issues? You talk about paragraph 32 about communication between school and home during closure periods.
Yes.
Was reduced or lost entirely for some families. Would you?
Yes, that's right.
To elaborate on that.
We know because people kind of literally left the building and were told not to go back into it, whether it was a nursery, early learning centre, or a school. They left the building, the staff I'm talking about, without any equipment, without contact details for families or parents. And there was no communication at all for a significant number of families throughout the period, actually. And even when staff could go back in and could get the equipment, there wasn't equipment for every member of staff and so on. So I guess for us the concern around was about contingency planning, but also about communication and relationships with families, so people wouldn't know how those families were doing because they weren't able to get in touch with them. And we really felt that this was a vital thing, that schools and nurseries should get in touch with families and ask if they were okay.
And those families, some of them, were they getting in contact with you?
Yes, well, they completed our survey saying that they'd had no contact from the nursery or the school.
And what were some of the concerns of families that, you know, had they been able to be contacted, could have been helped? What were some of the issues they were facing?
I think that some of the families did need support. They maybe had social care involvement. They had certainly had additional support for learning in school, and all of that was taken away. So the families were literally left to manage who had support from different kinds of services, and they were at a loss. They didn't have the equipment or the specialist knowledge to support their child.
And you touched on there, you mentioned contingency planning, and you had that concern as part of contingency planning. What was your concern there, and what did you feed back about communication and contingency planning?
Well, we fed back that this was essential and that it needed to be improved, because schools and nurseries are the gateways to can be the gateways to lots of services for families. They are the organisations, the establishments that see children every day. They know how they are. So there were families that nobody saw and nobody knew how they were doing because of the lockdown, and they had no means of getting in touch to find out. So I think we had comments from families saying they felt abandoned. We had one parent with a son with autism who would not get out of bed because he felt his daily structure had been taken away from him, and he couldn't cope.
Are there any other, before we move on to look at childcare hubs, are there any other key impacts relating to remote learning that you'd like to highlight based on the surveys and the engagement you had with parents?
I think parents were concerned about the kind of social contact and skills and development of their children. So I think particularly parents with much younger children who didn't go to nursery or didn't, we'll maybe talk about it later, but the parents didn't get to go into the nursery building at all, and didn't get to go into, the school P1 and P2. So there became a disconnect, I would say, for some families between school and home.
Well, we can maybe touch on that now then. I think you're referring to transitions, because we've heard something about that already in our early learning and childcare sessions. You referred to that paragraph 62 to 66. What were the specific concerns? Well, obviously the inquiry is aware of the importance of transitions, but would you care to elaborate on that, the importance of transitions and what the specific concerns were that the parents had?
I think the main issue for parents was that they weren't able to visit or see the school or the nursery where their child was going to go. They weren't able to meet the staff. These are all normal parts of transition, and actually parents need to. That helps parents develop confidence in the people who are going to be looking after their child and helping their child to learn and progress, and that wasn't able to happen for several year groups actually, and also in secondary school, S1 and S2. So,
have any of your subsequent surveys looked at transitions or the ongoing? Are there any ongoing issues with in relation to the absence of transitional support at that time?
We've looked at transitions in the past. We're just doing a survey just now about how is your homeschool partnership going. So we're going to be interested to see what parents are feeling like their homeschool partnership, how the relationship is. But in terms of transitions, sorry, I'm losing my thread a little bit here. Transitions, they're normally they're set piece things that happen. It's a visit for the children, it's a visit for the parents, of kind of familiarisation visits. There's talks, meet the teacher, or the form teacher in secondary school. There's these opportunities for parents to gather and get a feel for the place where their child is going to be. So obviously all of those standard things didn't happen and couldn't happen.
Well, perhaps we can then move on to discuss issues in relation to access to childcare hubs, which we've heard something about already. You discuss this at paragraphs 50 to 51, and one of the matters you talk about is a lack of clarity regarding eligibility criteria. Would you care to expand on that, please? What the specific concerns were?
So nobody was clear what the eligibility criteria were, and we did press Scottish Government repeatedly to offer a definition, and I think the answer was that local authorities would need to decide this for themselves. So then local authorities were deciding for themselves, and it was never clear what the criteria were, what the definition of vulnerable was, and we very strongly felt that people should be able to self-refer, because we were hearing from families who were desperate because social services and support at school had been removed, and they had nowhere to go. So we also pressed for kind of helplines to be set up by local authorities. I think that did happen eventually. But the hubs, we felt that parents should be able to, as I say, self-refer. But it's still very opaque. We don't know what the criteria were. We believe it was like children with child protection concerns around them, but it's not clear what the criteria were.
And just related to that, you referred to a lack of uptake by eligible children. So even where maybe it was clearish, there was a lack of uptake. Did you get any inkling or insight into why that might have been from your surveys or responses?
Less from our surveys. We did ask, was anybody accessing them, but it was tiny amounts. But I had a friend who worked in one, and what I understood in Edinburgh was that they were only a few of them across the city, so children who might be deemed to be vulnerable could actually get to them. So they weren't where the children and the families were. And I suspect that's probably the case across Scotland, that local authorities decided who to invite, and then it wasn't clear that transport arrangements were made available or that it was followed up. So certainly my friend said there was hardly anybody there ever that she worked.
And were the hubs in specific, were they sort of evenly spread, or where were the hubs that needed transport to get to?
Well, they were quite far apart. There weren't very many of them, There weren't very many of them, and they were far apart. So even in a city, I think it was difficult for people to get there.
And were they static? Oh, sorry. Were they static, or did they...
I'm not sure. I'm not sure anybody knows where they were. There was one in my area, but it was like the whole of north of Edinburgh, I think. So maybe there was only one or two. I don't know, I'm afraid.
And we've heard about inconsistencies between local authority areas in terms of eligibility criteria. Was that something that your parents had any concerns about?
Well, we had several parents feeling that they needed to access these hubs, ones with children with additional support needs, specifically, some with complex needs, and also for the first kind of period of lockdown, key workers as well, and I guess, I suppose, teachers, teaching staff who also have children, were supposed to juggle everything as well. So again, it was impossible to know how it was being decided who could be eligible, or indeed how to get in touch to find out. If you were struggling, who did you get in touch with to say, I need help?
And you mentioned that one of the things you promoted was parents, self-referral by parents. What percentage of parents were vulnerable?
I think, I've got statistics on people who felt they weren't. So there was didn't have what so everything at home. So that's one indication they were not. You would think that would mean that they were struggling. We're talking kind of a sense that the authority should trust parents to use a scarce resource. If you had a helpline, if you had people able to say, these are my circumstances, I'm really, not coping, that could be addressed or sorted, or support could be signposted for these families if it wasn't a hub, but there wasn't anything.
Even latterly?
Latterly, I think they had phone numbers. We did at one point look at the local authority websites, and we compiled a web page of the links to those local authority web pages, which had the kind of emergency contact details. So it was more kind of emergency social care. So I don't know how well that operated. I don't know what the uptake was.
Before we move on to the next impact, which is impacts on children with additional support needs, so you've already mentioned, is there anything else in relation to hubs or access to hubs that you wish to raise?
Just the lack of transparency, the lack of openness. It may be that local authorities themselves didn't know what their criteria were, or weren't willing to publicise them, but somebody knew, and Scottish Government wasn't willing to define or say. So we did try and find guidance and all of these things, but didn't manage to do any of that, because we were trying to help parents understand whether they might be eligible or not, so that they could get in touch with somebody and see. So I guess it was that gap between government and local authorities, and the communications loop as well, and whether things were set up so that could happen.
Thank you. If we can move on then, as I said, to discuss any impacts on families with children with additional support needs. I think you discussed this at paragraph 40 to 44. You said, I think, that they felt more impacted than anyone else and felt abandoned. Would you care to elaborate on some of the concerns that you were hearing about?
I think it's just the fact of the matter that supporting a child with additional needs at home with their learning is difficult. They get specialist help in school, they have specialist equipment in school. Some of them will have one-to-one support in school, and all of that was removed. I know from my own experience, I've got three now grown-up children with additional support needs, concentration spans, motivations, all the things that are a struggle for them, focus in school. Trying to do schoolwork at home is incredibly difficult. So we know those families struggled. We know that they didn't have tailored support that would help them. And I mean, in the end, I think many of us, our organisation included, said focus on learning at home, not doing schoolwork at home. You know, if you can spend time together, reading together, or going for a walk, or cooking together or talking together. These are all learning at home, and these are all completely crucial parts of a child's development. But parents were very concerned that they weren't doing what was necessary with schoolwork. So there's a lot of pressure. And I think when your child has additional support needs, you feel that even more strongly. And also, parents with children with additional support needs are used to fairly regular meetings with school staff to look at, progress and support and these things. And that obviously was taken away as well. And then when they did go back to school, the specialists weren't allowed to go into school. And in some circumstances, there hadn't been a specialist in school for 18 months because of COVID restrictions. So.
You mentioned a loss of structure, which you've touched on already. You also mentioned a backlog in additional support needs diagnosis. What could you elaborate on that? What is being experienced in relation to that, and is that ongoing?
I think there's still problems, but it did last a long time, because that does sometimes involve a specialist going into school to do assessments, to work one-to-one with the child, and then to make referrals. So I think we all know that the mental health services for children and young people are massively stretched and oversubscribed. So that wasn't helped at all by COVID. It's certainly exacerbated. But yes, diagnosing, neurodiversity, what tools and IT kit is of use to children. Usually a specialist comes in to help with that from the local authority. So none of that was happening. So, yeah.
And I think you also mentioned lack of or inconsistent access to special support in schools. What was that inconsistent? Was that across local authorities or just
as far as we could
schools?
see, it was. There were some schools and some teachers who did provide the tailored support and tailored resources, of course, and some that didn't presumably have capacity or that did involve specialists or specialist equipment. And they just couldn't work one-to-one with the children. So the specialists, as I said, couldn't come in, whether it would be a physio or an OT, occupational therapist, or someone bringing IT equipment or looking at special tools or writing pencils or whatever. That couldn't happen. And also, I think some schools have learning support departments, high schools, or they have a learning support teacher in a primary school or assistants, and because there were restrictions on who could go into which classroom and people were to stay in bubbles, particularly I think for primary that would be problematic, because you wouldn't be able to have a learning support teacher working one-to-one with a child at that time either.
Before we go and consider issues that arose in relation to the reopening of schools, was there anything else in relation to particular impacts on families with children with additional support needs?
I think just that these are the families that often face the most challenges and need the most support, and to help the children and the young people learn, they need the most input, and it was taken away with the lockdowns, but it was not put back again afterwards. So I think the most vulnerable were hardest hit through the experience of COVID, and there didn't seem to be for a long time any special provision or consideration for that.
And do you know why that was? Have any of your parents fed back or had feedback on that?
I don't know. No, some, I guess, the children hadn't been diagnosed or hadn't had the kind of support that they needed identified, and some may not have been in nursery, or those specialists weren't going into nursery, so when there was transition into school, that none of that would have been identified with specialist involvement.
In terms of then turning to school reopening, I think, were there any particular issues arising in relation to the phased return to learning, when there was, some people were still at home and some people were in school, and not every day, pupils were not in school every day? Were there any particular issues that arose in relation to that for families?
I think it was quite complicated, and families with multiple children, it just was difficult. I think it was complicated and difficult, and also I guess not knowing. We were at that time, I was watching the daily briefings, I was listening for the words, massive engagement. That's when parents could really get. So yeah.
You touched on well-being and how could health and well-being if you didn't know what had been happening and during the concerns in relation to focus on health and well-being. I think you mentioned at paragraph learning.
Yes.
Concern.
We parents have not been asked about, which seemed to us that there wasn't. Not only were they not asked about how their experience had been, and was there anything that the school needed to know, for example, that had happened during the first lockdown, but nor were they asked about the child's learning. So 66% were not asked about their child's learning during lockdown. So I think there was definitely a sense that parents felt quite hurt about that. Those that had managed to support the child's schoolwork at home had pulled out all the stops to do it, and then there wasn't very much interest in what they had done. So in terms of continuity, it's serious in the point of continuity of learning, and we very much were advocating that in order to have a smooth transition back into school, schools needed to know how families had been during that time and what learning had been happening, so that they could, as it were, hit the ground running. But I think they did their own assessments and checks on what learning had been happening. So it wasn't really much of a transition back into school, I would say.
And concerns about provision of support for secondary school pupils to complete missed coursework due to lockdown and absence. I think you've got reference to that in paragraph 52. What were those concerns?
So there were concerns around what had been made available the first lockdown, the online learning, what had been made available, because it was quite slow to start in some schools, in some subjects. It was very varied. Not all teachers had digital skills to enable them to deliver online learning, or materials that were ready to do online learning with. Some did, some didn't. So I guess it was patchy. Some young people could and would learn during the lockdown period for their subjects for qualifications, and some couldn't. And then the second period of lockdown, the same thing kind of happened all over again. There was more organisation around online learning and more opportunities, but it didn't work for everybody. And so some young people still missed learning because they weren't in school and weren't getting the support that they needed to focus. So, and then that, obviously, if you miss coursework for qualifications, it has a knock-on effect. So parents were very concerned about that. And then later, being absent, as we've talked about, when they had COVID or were required to leave that, I think it was 5 days eventually, after they'd had symptoms showing, to stay at home, and them not getting any learning during those periods.
So just in relation to that, if children, when the schools were back, the children that were absent because of having to self-isolate, was there any provision for that, or their particular concerns? Is that the concern about support for secondary pupils?
That's right, and so I'm just looking at my survey results, but they again. So the survey 6, that was 54% said no alternative arrangements for learning during individual absences had been made. 46% said there were alternative arrangements when individual pupils were absent for periods of time. So you've got just over half, obviously, saying that when their child was off ill, not necessarily being actually ill, but just, doing that period of isolating at home that was required, there was no learning provided for them.
You mention then parental engagement and communication in several different contexts. Specifically in paragraph 38, there was a concern raised about a delay in parents being allowed back into schools for events and meetings and inconsistencies around that. Please could you elaborate on what the concerns were with that?
So this was a time where, and we were asking parents if they had been invited to have parent consultations of some sort or another, and also whether they were able to get back into schools. So there was massive inconsistencies, and some schools and some nurseries didn't have parents back into the building for many, many, many months, and well into 2021. Even after the summer of 2021, they still weren't having people back into the school. So I think local authorities could give, Scottish Government gave guidance, local authorities could do guidance of the guidance, and then head teachers could decide, or nursery leaders could decide, and they all decided it in various ways. So for us, it felt like parental engagement, although parents had been fully involved delivering, schoolwork at home with their children in the periods of lockdown, when it came to actually more business as usual, parents felt very shut out. So it was almost like a roller coaster, like full involvement, no involvement, full involvement, no involvement. And we were advocating that on the basis that parents had been fully involved in their children's learning, those that could manage to be, the time that they knew most about what their child was learning. And we felt that that could be built on, because there's plenty of academic evidence that where parents are engaged and involved and informed about their child's learning, children make more progress and have better outcomes. So we were very keen that not at that level, obviously, but that the communication, the understanding of what your child is learning should be continued, because there are benefits for many children. So, but that just dropped right off when they went back to school. It was how it had been before COVID. Some schools are absolutely brilliant, don't get me wrong. They're really good at keeping parents informed about learning, and it's not just about progress reports, it's about having a conversation at home about what a child's been doing at school that's a bit more meaningful than just getting it was fine type of answer, yeah. So I guess we had hoped for something positive to come in terms of parent-school relationships and communication.
Yesterday, the inquiry heard evidence from School Leaders Scotland, which is a trade union you'll no doubt be familiar with, that represents, amongst others, head teachers, deputy head teachers and principal teachers. And one of the witnesses observed in his evidence that there's been an increase in conflict, or I think he termed it conflict, between schools and parents, for example, with parents taking the child's side in including disciplinary matters or otherwise. And he thought this might be attributable to a societal change more generally, but possibly also to the pandemic. And he noted that there's been a degree of disengagement as well on the part of parents. Just given what you were talking about there and the communication and things going back to usual, is this something that you recognise as an issue or is that the same issue, or is this a different issue that you think he's referring to there?
We do think that the legacy of COVID is enormous for children and young people particularly, and then also for their parents. I've described this roller coaster of full immersion where, whether you can or you can't, you're meant to take full responsibility for your child's schoolwork, to not knowing anything much about it at all, and this disconnect about being responsible for the learning, responsible for the health and well-being. Then your child goes back to school and nobody asks you about how your family has been, if anything's happened, is there anything the school should know, to be aware of, how the child's learning has gone. So there's a complete disconnect from that. So that kind of roller coaster, it doesn't always build constructive relationships going forward. I think, the vast majority of survey respondents were delighted when their children were able to go back to school, and were very thankful of staff. I think people have a short fuse now. I think we were all faced with kind of life or death, it felt like it was, situation. And I think in the context of that, there's a short fuse. I think for the families who couldn't manage the school learning, who didn't feel supported, who felt abandoned, historically there have been families who they've had, the parents have had a bad time at school, and that can be passed on to children, in that if the children and the young people feel there's nothing there at school for them. So there's a whole raft of stuff around disengagement and behaviour and interactions, which is not just to do with parents and children, far from it. It's to do with how does the school approach relationships, what is the offer for young people. If a school is offering primarily academic subjects, that's not going to work for about half of the population in schools. So there's a lot of research and work around difficulties. Obviously, it's not acceptable for anybody to, behave aggressively, but actually it's about building relationships, building them at the outset. Don't wait to be in touch with parents when there's trouble. Build the relationship, build a positive one early on, nursery, primary, secondary. Make sure the communication channels are open, that parents know who to speak to if they're worried. If a parent is upset if a parent is upset because something's going on at school, there's probably something that the child is presenting at home. It may be that there's an underlying issue. It's about finding out, working together. It's not about polarising, parents, staff. I don't think it's helpful to talk in those terms. It's about how to find a way to go forward.
Before we move on to the subject of SQA exams and the alternative certification model and the issues around that, was there anything else you'd wanted to raise about communications and issues on return to schools?
Just at the heart of it, as I've said, are positive relationships and positive attitudes and respect for one another, and that takes an effort. It's not a given. Because a child in school, everybody feels respectful of each other. It needs a bit more than that. So, and it did in these times as well. And where that didn't happen in school communities, there were problems. Those parents never heard from those schools. So it's about best practice, I think.
Thank you. At paragraphs 45 to 49, you discuss issues relating to changes in SQA exams and the introduction of the alternative certification model, which was implemented to address challenges posed by the cancellation of exams. Could you please explain the concern that parents had around this and why they were concerned?
So I think the alternative certification model, it came quite late. We had been asking about it for quite a long time. So it came quite late. So parents didn't understand the system that already existed, which is basically that teachers do estimate grades. That happens, I think, at 2 points in the year. I'm not a teacher, I don't know, but I think there's one in autumn and one a verification, validation in the spring. And that gets sent to the SQA to sense check their marking, I believe, is how it operates. Parents didn't know about that, young people didn't know about that, because it's something that schools don't like to talk about, although I'm not entirely sure why, but I guess they want to distance themselves from SQA results in some way. But because parents didn't know about that, then the alternative certification model came as a, like, oh, teachers haven't done this before, teachers, but actually teachers would have been doing that all along. So it wasn't. So I think the complexity was around the pupils who had missed learning. Some pupils prefer exams, some parents prefer exams, tends to be ones that do better. But for those that hadn't been able to do continuous learning, that would then lead them to get good estimates probably from their teacher, who like to do a kind of dash at the end, this alternative certification model wouldn't have been a very attractive proposition, I think. So I think there's confusion around it and not having any basis for understanding that this was something that teachers did all the time.
And then you mentioned paragraph 48 concerns about the SQA modelling and awarding of grades according to the area in which pupils attend school. What were parents' concerns around that?
I think, again, what came out of this whole process was a greater understanding of how the SQA moves bands for different grades. So the banding can go up or down depending on how a cohort of pupils has done. But there's also a sense check which is against a previous model of a similar school or the same school. So there was a massive concern about schools in areas of social deprivation which were being benchmarked effectively against themselves. So the opportunity for young people to make progress or do better was artificially constrained by this kind of sense-checking benchmarking. But I think you probably need to ask the SQA about that. But that was what the concern was. People hadn't understood that SQA banding for grades goes up and down depending on the cohort, that essentially it's a kind of competitive grading system, that 1 year a performance would end up in a different grade to a similar performance a different year. So I think that has led to more discontent about the qualification system and the grading system.
Okay, and then finally, in relation to this, you mentioned at paragraph 49 some campaigning that connected in relation to a lack of consideration of exceptional circumstances by SQA. Please explain a little bit more about that.
So part of SQA appeal system has been, as long as I can remember, that there are exceptional circumstances. So if someone is very ill or suffers a bereavement or something, the school can let the SQA know and exceptional circumstances can be applied. That often does, I believe, mean looking at coursework and giving a grade based on that. For whatever reason, the decision was taken that exceptional circumstances would not apply in these COVID years, when it was the time when there was most chance that young people had experienced extreme difficulties and challenges, whether it would be mental health or whether it would be bereavement or long COVID or whatever. So they decided not to apply it. So we campaigned hard that this was the very time they really needed to apply that consideration. I don't know why they didn't apply it. Perhaps they thought they'd be inundated, but that's that was what they did. We felt they prioritised their integrity above the achievements and health and well-being of young people.
Just in terms of the final point that I have on my list to cover with you, and I'll invite you to address anything else that you might have, is absence rates. You mention it at paragraph 67. And you also refer elsewhere in your statement, unfortunately I don't have the reference for the paragraph, about ongoing impacts in terms of absence and behaviour. What were the issues noted by parents in relation to absenteeism and feelings of abandonment?
I think one of our surveys showed that the rates of absence were high during 2021. And we know from what schools have told us and the government statistics that some children never went back to school. Sometimes that can be because of parental anxiety or health issues. That can also be anxiety or long COVID or, health issues in children and young people. But there is still a lower attendance rate now in the kind of post-COVID years than there was before COVID. So something has gone awry for some families and some children and young people, and they've just never come back to school. I think that in some education circles they're called ghost children now, I think. So and I know local authorities and the Scottish Government are focusing on this now, and they're beginning to look harder at some children will be home educated, but they should be known about by the local authorities. But yeah, it's a real concern.
Ms. Woolnough, just before I ask you to address any lessons to be learned, were there any other impacts that you wanted to discuss or address? We have your statement anyway.
Yes,
I think we've pretty much covered all of them.
So.
But
no, I think I've emphasised the and you've drawn out the main impacts on the vulnerable families and children and young people, and families who became vulnerable, who weren't vulnerable or known to social services or schools before the pandemic. That, I think, was why we were asking for the self-referral to hubs, because there would be families who became vulnerable because of that experience.
And finally, you've got a section, and we have that in your statement, on lessons to be learned, but were there any particular lessons that you wish to draw to the inquiry's attention?
Well, I've mentioned contingency planning, and I guess at the heart of it is still communications with parents and families, knowing and making sure contact details are up to date, keeping in touch with families, the importance of health and well-being in families and children and young people's health and well-being. There's still, in some schools, a resistance to being, and probably in some families, a resistance to being involved in health and well-being and care, and we strongly think that needs to change, because schools are gateways for all of these services, and also they're an essential part of their communities. Mm-hmm. So that's not really an impact. Sorry, I digressed.
It can be a lesson as well. Ms. Woolnough, unless you had anything to add, I don't. My lord, unless your lordship does. That's the end of my questions.
I've got no questions, I'm happy to say, but I'd just like to thank Ms. Woolnough for her very helpful evidence. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, my lord. Thank you.
We shall take a break for lunch now, and we'll come back at 1:45, I believe. So 1:45. Thank you.
Thank you, my lord.